What's going on, everyone? This is episode two of a special edition episode that we like to call Four More Things with Evan Heiter. Evan, we're so happy that you're here one more time and probably again this season because we're obsessed with this segment that you came up with. So today, Evan's going to give us four things that are happening in the landscape of NCAA gymnastics. Who knows? Could be on the men's side, could be on the women's side, could be in the elite side. We do have Winter Cup coming up this weekend. But my guess is we're going to stick to college with some four things that Evan has some thoughts on. So, Evan, I'm going to shoot it over to you. What's the first thing that we are bringing to the floor today?
Thank you so much. Always glad to be here. But what is that? That cometh on the second and probably final pass. It is the front tuck step out, of course. Yes, this is truly taking me back to some of my best little gay boy show off on the tumble track moments from my youth. The front tuck step out is a welcomed addition to most collegiate floor routines in my book. However, this is said with deep, deep conditional truths. First, this is likely either in your first or second and final pass. The fatigue and focus are truly evident if you're not trying to work through that. And from my perspective, this is much more evident than other skill choices. This needs to be treated like a dynamic tone setting element in a tumbling run. Why am I seeing these front tucks dump down into the ground, only necessitating a jammed up round off, a gained back handspring, and a culminating under rotated double tuck? I think it can be better. Also, further, that aforementioned dynamism enables a beautiful kick out. Who is it? It's Lilia. She's calling, she's wondering. And this needs to be highlighted by extended ankles and feet through the toes. Not having this emphasizes the lack of attention and preparation to execute the pass flawlessly. Curious if there's any thoughts or feelings, but I feel like this is the first season where we're truly seeing it, across the board, in the two pass era, and just the front tuck step out coming into focus.
This is great. I have never stopped to think about this in as much depth as you have, so I'm loving this. I'm trying to, the whole time you were talking, I was trying to both listen and figure out what I would equate a front tuck step out to on a different event. And it almost reminds me of the pre-flight on a vault, where if your pre-flight is off, you're screwed. And the vault is either a major cry for help on the landing or it's great because the pre-flight is great. And I do think there's been more emphasis on the pre-flight and when you see forward and backward views of the event. And the front tuck through is like, oh, she's just adding it in there to get that bonus or to hit the requirement she needs to. So I do agree completely. And I think we overlook the front through a lot. And I'm now reliving routines in my head and thinking maybe that would have gone differently if there had been more attention to the, the kip, so to speak, the pre-flight, so to speak. So I like this take a lot.
I couldn't stop thinking about those that have taken the front through to the next level to go to like the front layout, right? I'm thinking of the Jocelyn Robertsons, the Leah Smiths of the world, dare we say the WCCs of the world, who are taking that element and they execute it very well. But I do have that panic moment of that crunchy round off that has the opportunity of coming right after that element. Um, I'm not directing that comment at Jocelyn and Leah. But this idea of throwing it in to add difficulty or throwing it in to make sure you can get that two pass, it's like I'm also thinking of that little ring leap full on floor that is getting added, and I just don't see many amazing ones that I'm loving to get to that 10-0 start value. So in general, my take on it is we need to be like having a beautiful round off back handspring into whatever skill you're doing out of it, or we're not adding an element before it. That's my take.
It's sound technique, and it also is, Liv, I can appreciate what you're saying just in terms of like it is what enables great technical tumbling. It's like a precursor, a non-negotiable. And so I even think about it when you're seeing an athlete running and like approaching, and so many athletes get like up in their shoulders, and it's just like I can't wait to like get my hands on the ground. Same thing with vault, it's like you're hurtling high. And so I think the front tuck is like you're punching up into the air and trying to like gain momentum from how you're, coming out of it. Um, and so I just feel like so often we're just seeing like I'm like hucking my body over just for the sake of, again, getting like the requirement fulfilled.
The one thing I'll say it's making me think of is a Rudy off beam because that was my dismount my senior year, and that was the feedback I always received was you're dumping down, you're trying to get to the floor faster than you're actually doing the skill, and every time it was like a throw your arms up and your body up and your chest up, the skill was significantly better. So I do agree. This is a great take. I never thought of it the way you're putting it, and it's important to think about when you're looking at the actual nuances and technicalities of these two pass routines that have more jam packed into less tumbling jumps, etc., where there's more room for error. And this could be one of those catalysts.
I think it's a good differentiator as well. Like the span from good to excellent is super wide, and I just don't feel like there's a ton of emphasis or attention being paid to getting your front tuck step out. I realize it sounds so, like same thing. You could say it's a round off. Like how often are we saying like her round off is so well executed? But I think the technical, I think of Simone Biles' back handspring. Like that is a phenomenal example of an amazingly technical sound, just like on autopilot every time way to do a very basic skill that allows you to do the rest of it. So we're starting off strong. Love it. Appreciate the perspective. Now we're going to go to the subjectivity of it all. And this is ringing loud and true in 2025. And I think back to Jim Tournette, stay with me, football, American football, where on review, we're constantly hearing, did he have control of the ball? And that's for the rules expert to decide with the very, very important aid of video review here. This is not, nor is it intended to be an apples to apples comparison with gymnastics. But I can't help but wonder, did she have control of the tumbling pass? And what's more, was that dance, leap, jump out of said tumbling pass done with precision and intent? The same way a regular lunge landing would be looked at? So suffice to say, I think we've come a long way in terms of like controlled jumps and leaps out of passes, but the choreographic choices are opening an ominous door for me. And right now, as I see it, the choreographic choice to avoid a landing deduction is just taking jazzier steps, more so than a lunge, and that's okay. For me, it's a no, and I'm curious if you guys have thoughts here.
My thought is that I find myself watching some jumps out of tumbling passes and going, what is that in the code? Is that a straight jump? Is that a stag? Is that a ring stag? Is that like, what is that element? And if that ominous, using your word, that ominous perspective of what shape skill is being done is in question, I think that it opens the door of saying, can it actually be something that covers up a landing, used choreographically to, eliminate deductions or reduce deductions? Um, I think this is really interesting. The Gracie Kramer straight jump that, Emily Innes straight jump that happens, that turns into this like big C shape. You know, it does feel like that C shape comes from a concept of lack of control. But it's also big and beautiful, and it creates an artistic element that I think is unique and different. Um, the other side of this coin, for some reason, the routine that comes to mind, I believe it was Leanne Wong's first pass this past weekend. Um, she's like the queen of cover-ups on landings, and it looks so gauge and so beautiful and so artistic, and footwork is on point. But at the end of the day, she didn't land the tumbling pass properly and with control, showing, 2-second landing, whatever the case, those like terms we're using. And I'm not cool with, this wondering if that was dance or wondering if that was a cover up idea in the wake of us trying to just streamline all deductions and trying to look at this from the perspective of like, what is a 1/10 step, what is a half 10 step, and what is a no deduction landing.
I do wonder, I was thinking about two things came to mind. The first was when Maggie Nichols came back from her foot injury. I don't remember what year it was, but I think this might have been one of the first two pass floor routines that scored incredibly well. And she did the 1.5 to the front layout step out and took like 3 steps out of it and walked. And it looks beautiful. It's one of those skills that, when done well, is excellent. But she took 3 steps out of it. And then I think later in the season, she ended up doing a tour jeté out of that for a connection. But I remember thinking to myself, she just walked 3 steps. So if she was over, just engage your core a little bit and like walk a couple steps, that's an excellent cover up. Was there actual control? Or, I know she does it with control, but I think of the Audrey Davis front aerial on beam directly falling down to her arms. Now, you need to be incredibly precise for that, or your butt's falling off the beam. But again, like that's a remarkable cover for something, for a landing. Those were two things that came to my mind that could create murky water, especially when, as commentators, Evan and I know, our job is to explain to people what showing control means on a landing, the 2-second hold. We're trying to explain why athletes are doing these things. It can get, you're in gray area there because she technically didn't perfectly plant the front foot and it gets a little confusing. From the jump perspective, I remember when Natalie Wojcik was a freshman, she did a gorgeous Rudy straddle jump at the end of her routine. And that straddle jump rarely traveled. It was a very punch in one place, land in the next. And I do think that sometimes the jumps get major mileage out of skills. You'll see a jump start not too far from the corner and end up pretty far back in the corner. And to me, while the jump might have removed a forward or backward step on the landing, that's a control issue. And so I do wonder if maybe there's just more education around what a jump out of a pass, what it should look like, what the parameters are. This probably exists somewhere, but from a blanket statement of when someone does a jump out of a pass, does it need to hit a certain position? If you're doing a straddle, does it need to be in a specific, if you're doing this straight jump, what should or should it not? I don't know. I mean, it's so murky and subjective, like you said, Ev, as the beginning of this segment, but I do wonder from a viewer perspective how tricky that could be when you're trying to educate about certain landing parameters, and then out of left field comes a swan dive that you've never seen before and you don't understand. It maybe looks a little wobbly why the athlete wasn't deducted.
Yeah, I think what both of you are touching on is two really important balancing points that are the sport of gymnastics, and that's artistic, freedom, or the ability to finesse things and do things in your own way. So we're not saying like that can't count because it's too different, or did you really mean to do that? And so that leads me to my next point of intention. What did you mean to do? And if there is no clarity on that, it's not, if you didn't mean to land at this angle on your floor exercise routine, then that should be a deduction. And that's okay. I think it's just the resistance of like, yeah, it was nothing. And the judges, I do think they're dealt a super tough hand to play well a lot of times, especially for fans to interpret, and commentators to kind of like decipher. However, there just needs to be that reflexive accountability. The athlete did not intend to do it that way, so the judge therefore cannot not deduct for it or cannot ignore it. And that's something that is just going to ring true. So it is what it is, but I think it's something worth discussing. On to happier things and much more cut and dry conversations as far as I'm concerned. But if your name is Amari, you're killing it on floor. From where I'm sitting, Amari Drayton and Amari Celestine, of LSU and Missouri are two sides of the coin that embody collegiate floor exercise. They're punctuated by supreme tumbling and enhanced by a clear perspective on how they're moving to the music and understanding why they're moving that way. Really, truly, please do not miss them on floor. There are so many outstanding athletes competing around the nation on floor exercise, but these two are really setting themselves apart for me for all the right reasons. And these routines look very different, but just undeniable kind of like these are routines that you think if I'm going to a national championship, I hope I get to see this in person because I just feel like on TV, it's not doing it justice.
No notes.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree
All
more.
right.
I mean, that Amari Drayton double layout, are you joking? And then we get to see in the same rotation, we get to now see a Kalia Lincoln double layout. Come on. Come on.
Yep. All
There,
right. I'm going to bring it home. Tale as old as time, but somehow everyone, we're back with this annual debate of what is college gymnastics and is it legit? And OMG scoring WTF. And I sit very comfortably in my armchair floor vault specialist role. And from this perspective, one thing reverberates off the walls of my apartment week in and week out, and that's winning. The exposition of the scores and why, developing athletes, getting recruits, building a program are all beautiful essays in the pages of collegiate gymnastics. But all of those pages have a footnote that's clear winning. Everyone wants to and should not be afraid to say, we show up to win. This is one of the undeniable aspects of athletics that firmly connects and cements sports within that realm. Compete to win, and the rest will sort itself out. And I just want, kind of like we have to have this North Star of, there are so many things that make gymnastics a unique kind of enigma in sports, in collegiate sports. But winning is something that we can all connect back to. And I think a lot of the static, a lot of, the discussion, for some programs, maybe if you're not winning, it becomes something worth saying or worth ignoring. But if you are winning, it's like when it's good, it's good, and let's roll with that. So just a reality that's kind of a little more existential than a specific aspect of the sport or something that we saw. But it is something that's coming to mind as I see, the dialogue go back and forth this year.
I love that. And it's funny because today I saw a tweet that said only in gymnastics would the number two team in the country, now number three, knock off the number one team in the country who still remains number one because of all the NQS stuff. And I found that really funny because it's true. The sport has so many nuances. It's not as cut and dry as win and loss in the regular season, of course, to seed for later in the year. But at the end of the day, everyone should want to win. And, Oklahoma still being number one at the top of the NCAA ranking, I can only imagine what that bus ride back and what that airplane ride was home for the Sooners because the Sooners are bred to win. And that's what everyone who's a college sports fan, an NFL, NBA, NHL, all you want to do is watch your team win. You want to root for your team to win. And so that's sports. That's the business of sports. And I agree with that, but it is interesting for fans and those of us so ingrained in the things about gymnastics that make gymnastics what it is, which becomes complicated when LSU beats number one and is now number three in the country. It's just such a funky thing. But from the perspective of winning, duh, you should want to win. You should want to go to a program where you can either help it to do better to win or go to a program because you see that winning potential and you want to win.
okay, I have a take. I think all conference championships should be seeded based on a win-loss record in conference.
Same. Thank you. Thank you. I've been saying this forever.
I have a couple reasons. And this season in particular, we're seeing some good examples of this having stakes of winning really possibly could matter more and across different conferences. Um, Number one, every time I go to explain to a general fan, a new fan, what NQS is, I lose them immediately, right? In general, from a fan engagement perspective, I think that conference matchups, conference dual meets drive great attendance and great buzz because it's the football teams are going after each other, the basketball teams are going after each other, and then all of a sudden when Alabama Auburn happens for gymnastics, for soccer, for volleyball, for whatever the case may be, the fans are showing up because of this rivalry. The fans are showing up because of a history of competitiveness, many of which those competitions are happening within their own conference. So now I talk about this in terms of twofold. One, it's already happening in the Big Ten. Olivia and I have talked about this for many years now. The Big Ten championship is not seeded based on NQS score going into the championship. It is based on a win-loss record across the entire season. For many of For people who don't understand what this concept of Big Fours is they do as many competitions as a dual meet matchups as they can during the regular season. And Big Fours is the answer to making sure that every Big Ten team can see as many Big Ten teams as they possibly can. And with the addition of Washington and UCLA this year, correct me if I'm wrong, Liv, each team will not see two teams in the Big Ten. I believe this year because there's Big Fours and I believe six regular season matchups with 12 total teams. So they've done this and there's a plan to circulate to make sure that as many of them can see each other as possible. But that win-loss record is going to be how they will see the Big Ten championship in 3 sessions. Right now, that matters because the NQS score of a team like Ohio State needs to increase for postseason when it comes to regionals and nationals. But right now, the win-loss record is not working in their favor. Now, I digress and go over to the SEC. We have Florida losing to Arkansas, LSU losing to Arkansas, LSU beating Oklahoma, Georgia beating Arkansas, just to name a few. And when you really start to layer what all of that means, I believe that the fact that LSU beat Oklahoma, with that in mind, that potentially should have a factor on the starting event for the top seeded team in the SEC championship. And it won't because NQS is the ranking system of how they will see the championship. And I think when it comes to those little nuanced pieces that are in the gap for a fan, those little pieces don't really they start to like lose its sting per se when it comes to how to actually see the sport from a competitive standpoint, where the stakes are at, and that yes, a 197 score is a really big deal, and we're excited for that within ourselves as true fans and like knowledgeable fans of our sport. But for the general fan who's coming to a home arena and seeing their team win, and then seeing the coaches be like, yeah, but we didn't get the score we wanted, that doesn't compute and that joy doesn't match up. And we need to have more emphasis on the win-loss record. That's my take.
Hard to argue. Those are the four things I had for you guys.
Popped
Evan, those
off.
are great. Can I
I'll do
add
my best.
can I add one thing to the conversation about the element after tumbling pass?
Yeah.
I couldn't stop thinking just about Aaliyah Finnegan's Double Arabian. It is a gift that we have that some people have such control in their tumbling pass that we get to see a beautiful leap or jump happening out of it, right? Now I understand I'm talking about an athlete who, when she hits it, it's undeniably incredible, gorgeous, beautiful, and I think I can talk about Aaliyah Finnegan's Double Arabian with many people, and the general consensus is that it's amazing. Now, we also have seen it land out of bounds and we've seen it be a little bit out of control. But I think in circumstances like that, I am gonna take that other side and suggest that like there are there are instances where I wouldn't want to see jumps out of tumbling passes completely go away. Um, any thoughts on that?
I think you you paint the wide spectrum of like what we've seen from this pass, like in particular, and this past weekend, versus OU, it was kind of like the best of the best. And from how I see it, it was very clear to my trained eye that she landed the double Arabian, knew it was perfect, and then it was like you're using the spring of the floor to do this rather than, and I know I'm over, so like here it is, and then the stag becomes, something else. So I think it goes back to intention, and it's not a clear point because basically in my ideal world, I would be like, someone doesn't even do the stag because they know they're over rotating. So it's like they should incur the deduction that's going to happen there. I just feel like connecting to something, whatever it is, should not negate a deduction that's there and still evident through whatever that connection point is. Um, and I would argue that a judge's eye should know when that's happening.
That's a good take. And honestly, I think that makes it more clear for anyone who's listening who doesn't really understand the nuances that we're speaking about with a tumbling pass connected to a jump. It's this idea of having control. It's running as fast as you can at the corner of a 40 by 40 foot floor and round offing and backhand springing and going real high, flipping and twisting and having complete control when your feet hit the ground first, and then adding the flair, the art, the artistry, the that moment is kind of what we are talking about. Um,
So another interesting point that just popped into my head, and I saw it run back on, I think Twitter, um, was Lily Hudson's 2.5 from this past weekend, and she sticks it cold. And in other weeks, it's the arabesque, reach through, and it's like for me, and this is not specific to Lily because there are, I mean, pretty much anyone else doing a soul 2.5 is not sticking a cold. I don't remember the last time I saw that happen. So like kudos, roses are thrown. However, those are very different approaches to the same element in the same routine, in the composition. So it's kind of like, you have this idea of insurance policy to where it's like, well, if I'm over, I'm just going to do the arabesque. Like, can't knock it. That's what the rules allow for. However, I feel like these are when judges are taking these deductions, when they're not taking these deductions. Those are the things that, Corey, to your point, fans can't follow and don't understand because I feel like even judges, there's dissonance in, that interpretation of what's happening there. So it's kind of like if you use the judge's interpretation as kind of like the either the foundation or the roof, anything in between, if that's not sound, then it's just going to lead to more chaos or further kind of like cracks within that.
I love it. Again, thanks, Evan. Those are fun. Those are fun. I do have one question for you, just because we watched some great gymnastics this past weekend, and we covered a lot of ground on this. The floor more things part of this. We covered winning, we covered, rankings, we covered all of this sort of stuff. But I want to know, what are some of the teams that are rising up at this point in the season that might have started off in a rough spot or maybe started off hot, came down? And what are the teams that come to your mind, Evan, of like keep an eye on them as we head towards the postseason because they're on their trajectory and they're going to drop that one score that was an anomaly and all of a sudden skyrocket in the NQS? What teams come to mind?
I mentioned the last time I was here, but Arizona, I feel like is continuing to stay dangerous. I feel like they have had a bit of like scoring variation throughout the last month. But when they're good, they're so good. And I do feel like they've climbed kind of within that, within the top 20, which is huge for them to stay dangerous in that regard. Similarly, NC State, I feel like their freshman and sophomore classes, the youth on their team, is really remarkable for where they're at in their careers and the gymnastics that they're displaying, and how reliant NC State is on those athletes. I've been surprised with that. And then the third one is actually something that's a bit interesting, but I would say Michigan, in that it's a harsh reality and a tough pill to swallow to be to like say we aren't where we once were, and it's just not there yet. But I think that what Michigan has continued to show is that they're able to build solid, like I would, it sounds so cliche, but like good gymnastics lineups, like solid lineups where they are actively avoiding some of those built-in deductions through majority of their lineups. And I think it is, just kind of like a lesson where it's like you have the high highs and then you have those, I won't even call them lows, but then you have just like that middle of the road. And that's an okay place to be. And I think what is engaging for me as a fan and an alum of Michigan is that it keeps you going. You want to feel like we're working towards something. Previously, it was like championship, like name them type of thing. And now it's kind of like, ooh, there's so much potential to, develop freshmen in new ways, to be, kind of like playing with the lineups. All Things Gymnastics just had an interview with Kaylee Boozer, who was, kind of like one of those great collegiate stories from Michigan, to where she's like learning skills, competing on events she never thought she would. And so that makes me excited, for, the development and where that program goes. And I do think, as we've seen in regional situations before, as has like betrayed Michigan in the past, or teams like Michigan in the past, like stay ready and hit at regionals. Like go all out at regionals. There's truly nothing to lose except the opportunity to continue to compete, which is big. However, it's like you gotta go big in that way.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Oh, I have one more thought that I just wanted you guys, as former student athletes yourselves. Um, Another thing that I've been hearing a lot of from coaches is how sickness is going through these teams. From your guys' experience, what was it like to have to navigate the waters of, you know, leaving someone home from sickness and having to step up in the lineup? But there's one side of it that's like giving other people opportunities, but we're also at that point in the season where settling into a lineup is really important. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit from your guys' experience as student athletes, but also what you're seeing across the country of like lineup mix-ups that we're seeing that are just shocking a little bit right now.
I will never forget my freshman year when the norovirus made its rounds in Ann Arbor. And Emma McLean and I were the two freshmen at the time, and Bev was like, get out of the dorms, get away, go stay with upperclassmen. You cannot be there. And so we did that. And one of our teammates got it, Lauren Marinas, and she was sick as a dog. I mean, it was hard, honestly, to hear how sick she was. She would come into practice in a mask and do a beam set and leave while she was sick because we didn't have depth at all. And when we traveled to southern Utah, which that's a story one day if anyone ever wants to hear that story, but it's very hard to get there. And we got there and she was so sick. I mean, she could barely pull together a beam routine. I don't know how she did, pulled it together. But it's so difficult because you're trying to navigate at that time, COVID hadn't happened, so masks were very unusual. And it wasn't normal to say, oh, I'll just grab a mask and that'll, make us feel better. We were distancing, we were trying to figure it out. We were also trying to take care of ourselves, trying to do gymnastics. And so it's so important that God forbid an injury happen to an athlete and you're out and you have to rehab it. But the sickness angle is, it's even more dangerous to try to practice or compete sick because that could increase injury, of course. But then also we've seen how things can fly through teams and knock out teams and have people stay home. And I never had that when I was at competing. We never had an athlete stay home from being sick that I recall. But that's why depth and recruiting a team that is able to put a counting score up at any given time is so important. Even if they're your 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 athletes, you never know what could happen. You never know if the plane could take off and someone's bag got left and their grips are in there. You should never put your grips in your check bag, but I digress. And you have to do a routine. You never know. And so I do think that the opportunity for student athletes who may not usually see competition opportunities may be more prevalent because of sickness and those things. But to the Michigan point, I think they're playing around with routines and we're seeing them give more experience to other student athletes. And I've seen that in other teams as well.
Yeah, as somebody who truly, the handful of times I competed, it was because elite guys were going to Winter Cup or somebody was injured, hurt, or sick. So I was like that 8, 9, 10 lineup to where it was like, just stay ready. And now, recently entering my mid, late, upper 30s, I just feel like also the emphasis, at least when I was in school, was not around like get as much sleep as you can. Obviously, it's kind of like rest, recover, but I feel like also just like 18 to 24-year-olds are just like built in a way where it's like even when your systems are like down and depleted, you're probably not like in an ideal state ever just during college. There's so much going on. There's life to be lived. And I feel like it's an important lesson to learn. And maybe it is, kind of like, in the wellness kind of wave that's really swept the world is I hope the athletes are, emphasizing that point more. I mean, I think you do your best with what you've got. Um, but I don't know. I feel like there's always going to be a trade-off. Like if it's not sickness, it's injury. If it's not, physical health, it's mental health. There are always going to be these things. So it's basically just like stay ready because expect the unexpected type of thing, which I think is a good life lesson to where it's like, you show up as a mid to late 30s adult and it's like, oh, you're not at 100% today. You still have to do everything that is expected of you and there is no like prize or consideration. It just is what it is. So I see the silver lining and just like, yep, that's real life. Gotta stay with it.
Yeah, the only thing I'm going to touch on this is I encourage fans to continue to trust that there's medical professionals rallied around each team making proper decisions for each student athlete, and that if a student athlete is not in a lineup, trust that they're it's not because they don't want to compete for their university, that there's likely a valid reason by which they're making a decision to either rest them or they're overcoming illness or some other external factor, that we just need to rely on smarter people than us as bystanders turning on, channels on this TV and watching streamed gymnastics on the weekends. That, you know, for example, Iowa putting up 5 on floor and 5 scores count, they did make it very known that 2 athletes were out with sickness, but that's just part of a sport. You navigate it, you put up a lineup, you get a score, you do your very best, and you see who shows up. And typically, what we've seen this season is that some really creative and unique lineups are showing up in significant ways, and it's making it really hard to figure out what those lineup choices are going to be because student athletes are absolutely showing up, and it's been cool to see. Hard to watch from the perspective of knowing people aren't getting opportunities because they're sick or whatever the case may be. But I encourage everyone to continue to trust that there's really great decisions being made by people that have more of a medical degree than I do. So that's where I'm at. Well, with that, Evan, thank you so much for another episode of Floor More Things. We'll see you back in a couple weeks. Who knows? It could be right around like conference championship time, and we could have some really exciting things to talk about for Floor More Things. So, with that, hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, thanks for listening. share it with a friend. And as always, slide into our DMs or messages and comments. We would love to hear from you of what you're loving about the On the Floor with Liv and Core podcast. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great weekend.